The history of European colonization of Africa is one of the most dramatic and consequential chapters in modern history. Europe was the continent that became infamous for its ambitions abroad. Africa was the continent that bore the brunt of these ambitions. By the year 1914, almost the entire African landmass had been divided up by European empires. Egypt, Sudan, Nigeria, Uganda, Rhodesia, South Africa, and more were all under the British flag. Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Madagascar, and further regions were claimed by France. Germany laid claim to German Southwest Africa, German East Africa, the Cameroons, and Togoland. Italy pursued its imperial dream in Eritrea, Libya, and Somaliland. Portugal seized Angola, Mozambique, and Cabinda, and merged them with Portuguese Guinea. Spain acquired the Spanish Sahara, Spanish Morocco, and Rio Muni. Belgium, through the personal ambitions of its king, rather than the state itself, secured control of the Congo. Only 2 African states remained free from this massive European takeover. These were Liberia and Ethiopia. This situation in 1914 stood in sharp contrast to just a few decades earlier. Before the scramble for Africa, Europeans controlled only about 10% of African lands, mostly coastal enclaves and trading posts. The transformation from minor holdings to near total domination happened with shocking speed in the late 19th century. To understand why this happened, we need to look back to the beginnings of European contact and colonization in Africa, and then follow the chain of events that led to the Berlin Conference and the Great Carve-up of the continent. The process had roots as early as the 16th century. Portugal was the first major European power to establish colonies on African soil. 4 decades, Portuguese traders and sailors had explored the Atlantic coast and built forts to control trade routes. They extended their control into Angola and Mozambique. Nearly a century later, the Dutch established their colony at the Cape of Good Hope in what is now South Africa. This became a vital outpost for ships traveling between Europe and Asia. France's ambitions in Africa began in earnest at the end of the 18th century, when Napoleon set his sights on Egypt. Although the French conquest of Egypt was short-lived, it showed how desirable Africa was becoming in the eyes of Europe. The British soon followed by seizing the Cape Colony from the Dutch in the early 19th century. Meanwhile, another unique chapter unfolded with the creation of Liberia. Freed African American slaves were resettled there with the backing of the United States. The idea was to establish a colony where they could govern themselves. Liberia thus became one of the only African states to retain independence in the age of imperialism. The 1830s and 1840s witnessed an acceleration of European activity. France captured Algeria in 1830 and pushed steadily inland over the following decades. Britain tightened its grip on South Africa and eyed further expansion. Germany remained absent at first, but under Otto von Bismarck, the country would soon enter the imperial race. By the mid-19th century, European explorers were penetrating deeper into the African interior, charting rivers, mountains, and forests previously unknown to outsiders. One man who watched these developments closely was Leopold II, King of Belgium. Belgium was a small European nation with little global influence, but Leopold was determined to change that. He concealed his ambitions beneath a mask of humanitarian concern. He claimed to be interested only in ending the slave trade and improving the lives of Africans. Using this guise, he declared the creation of the Congo Free State, a supposedly independent territory under his personal rule. The reality was horrific. Leopold's agents extracted vast wealth through the brutal exploitation of the Congolese people, especially through the rubber trade. Countless atrocities were committed, from forced labor to mutilations and mass killings. Word of these abuses eventually spread across Europe and shocked public opinion, but by then the Congo had already become a grim example of what imperialism could mean in practice. As European powers jostled for control of African lands, tensions began to rise. Each state feared being left behind in the new imperial race. The danger of outright conflict between European powers loomed large. To prevent war, Otto von Bismarck convened the Berlin Conference in November 1884. Representatives of all the major European states gathered in Berlin to hammer out rules for colonization. Notably, no African leaders were invited or consulted. The conference lasted until February 1885. Its purpose was to organize the scramble for Africa and to create a framework for claiming territory. The system they devised was straightforward. First, European explorers would travel to a region and sign treaties with local chiefs or rulers. These treaties were written in European languages that the Africans could not read or understand. They promised European protection, but in truth they served as instruments of surrender. Once signed, the treaties were taken back to the European governments for approval. If recognized by the other powers, the claim became official. In this way, swaths of Africa were rapidly annexed without genuine consent from its inhabitants. From this point forward, the scramble accelerated. Between 1885 and 1914, nearly the whole continent was partitioned. Rivalries between Britain and France, between Germany and Britain, between Italy and France, and many others shaped the map of Africa. The entire process was driven not only by competition, but by deeper motives as well. One major factor was the European attitude toward Africans themselves. Europeans at this time largely considered Africans to be racially and culturally inferior. This belief justified in their minds the conquest of the continent. They saw Africa as empty land open for the taking, even though it was home to countless societies, kingdoms, and empires with rich histories. The ideology of superiority gave imperialism a moral cover, though in reality it was simply a matter of greed and ambition. Economic motives were equally powerful. Africa was rich in resources that were highly valuable on the world market.
Coffee, sugar, coton, gold, diamonds, and above all rubber promised de vastes profits.
These raw materials could fuel the industries of Europe. Labor came from the African population, often forced into backbreaking work under cruel conditions. The economic logic of imperialism was simple. Colonies supplied raw materials which were shipped to Europe, manufactured into goods, and then sold back to colonial markets. Africa thus became part of a global system of exploitation. Exploration played another role. In the 19th century, adventurers, missionaries, and geographers traveled across Africa, mapping its rivers and mountains. They returned with stories of fertile lands, minerals, and resources. Their reports fired the imagination of the public and governments alike. But exploration was not easy. Africa presented a deadly environment for Europeans. Diseases like malaria and yellow fever earned West Africa the grim nickname of the white man's grave. Mortality rates among early colonists were catastrophic. 9 out of 10 settlers sent by the Royal African Company in the 18th century died within a few years. A major breakthrough came with the discovery of quinine extracted from the bark of the cinchona tree. Quinine proved effective in preventing and treating malaria. Suddenly, Europeans could survive in regions previously lethal to them. This medical discovery opened the floodgates for large-scale colonization. Yellow fever remained a danger, but malaria was no longer the insurmountable barrier it had once been. Technology also tilted the balance decisively in Europe's favor. The 19th century witnessed enormous advances in weaponry. Breech-loading rifles, percussion caps, and above all the Maxim gun gave European armies a crushing advantage over African warriors. The Maxim gun was the first true machine gun capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute. African fighters might have had muskets or older rifles, but nothing compared to the firepower unleashed by European troops. Battles often turned into massacres. Transportation also changed the game. The development of the steamboat allowed Europeans to navigate African rivers with greater ease, carrying supplies and soldiers deep inland. Railways followed, cutting through territories and enabling rapid movement of men and goods. With steamships and railroads, imperial powers could project force across vast distances in ways previously impossible. All these factors combined to create the conditions for the scramble. Rivalries between European nations added fuel to the fire. Britain and France were especially competitive, each eager to block the other from gaining more territory. Germany, newly unified under Bismarck, sought colonies to prove itself a major power. Italy, a latecomer to unification, also wanted its share of overseas possessions. Portugal and Spain clung to their older imperial dreams, though on a smaller scale. Belgium under Leopold pursued empire as a personal project. The result was a frenzied land grab in which the wishes and rights of Africans were ignored. By the dawn of the 20th century, Europe had succeeded in its imperial mission. The scramble for Africa was one of the most successful acts of conquest in world history. For Africans, however, it was a disaster. Traditional societies were disrupted, lands seized, populations forced into labor, culture suppressed, and resources extracted for the benefit of distant rulers. The scramble officially lasted from around 1870 until the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. But its effects continued long afterward. The colonial system remained in place until the mid-20th century. After the Second World War, decolonization began as African nations asserted their right to independence. One by one, colonies became sovereign states. By the 1970s, nearly all of Africa was independent. Yet the scars of colonization remained. Borders drawn in European capitals ignored ethnic and cultural realities and led to conflicts. Economies were often left dependent on exports of raw materials. Political institutions had been shaped under colonial rule in ways that created long-term challenges. Today Africa is free from European rule, but the legacy of the scramble lingers. The memory of exploitation, the artificial boundaries, the economic patterns, and the cultural disruptions still shape the continent. The story of the scramble for Africa is therefore not only a chapter of the past, but also a source of lessons for the present. It shows us how greed, rivalry, and a sense of superiority can combine to create immense suffering. It reminds us how decisions made in distant capitals without consultation of the people most affected can alter lives for generations. It also testifies to the resilience of African peoples who, despite the weight of colonization, reclaimed their independence and continue to build their futures.